Okay guys, I've waited until the wash with the stones has dried completely and now I'm ready to remove the masking fluid. I use my finger and carefully remove all the reserved spots. You can also do it with a tissue, whatever you find more comfortable. We now see how beautiful and whole our work looks, and we are ready to continue. Next, we need to paint the stones, the ones above water. In my case, here I try to go around them without painting them. Of course, some pigment got into them anyway. But if I were to do this work again, I would probably cover these stones as well as the glints with masking fluid. So, if you first watch my videos and then work, I recommend that you actually cover the stones with masking fluid too. It will be much more comfortable. Okay, I take this dark mix that contains Payne's Grey, orange and a little maroon, and I try to model the volume of the stone. Remember the exercise with the ball. I add warmer light tones in the light. These have more Naples yellow. You can add the color that I had mentioned, that is called shell pink, but it's not obligatory. We get this warm color, and I add more ultramarine nearby to add volume in the shadow. I continue to darken. After all, the shadows on the stones above water are some of the darkest parts in this work. Also, if you squint your eyes, you can notice that, or if you step away from the work and look at it. The core shadows of the stones and the reflection on the left are the darkest areas. All in all, the shadows in between the stones underwater look much lighter than the shadows above water in the stones. Water environment affects it. It lightens the shadows on the stones underwater. You should also remember that when analyzing a work tone-wise. I recommend doing it almost every time. It's a very important rule. If you don't want to do a tone sketch, you can simply convert the reference into black and white and look for the lightest and the darkest spot in the work. I meanwhile move to the stones above water in the distance. We need to try and build their volume too. These stones have an unusual shape. We can see they're a bit wet, dry in some places and wet with water in others. That's why such interesting lines appear. Try to depict it as far as your skill allows it. Since the stone isn't big, the working area isn't big either, but we can still try and show something. The important thing here is to show the shadow and light. I intensify the shadow, like so. and it starts to look good. And I add midtones, more terracotta hue. I just add more orange and maroon to it, and I blur the hard edges. Next, I take a fine tip brush. I use a reservoir brush by Pinex again. It makes working on the reflections very comfortable. You've already seen that. Let's continue. We move on to our favorite part, well, at least my favorite part. We'll be doing the lines of reflections on the most prominent parts of the waves. Here below we see the reflection of the stone. It's not a shadow, it's a reflection. So we shouldn't confuse these two notions. I'm sure you'll sort it out in the future, and when at the seaside you'll be looking at the boats and seeing that boats, especially on turquoise water, have a shadow. It's right on the sandbed. It can even be at some distance from the boat. It all depends on the angle of the sun rays, and the reflection will be right under the boat. I move on to the nearby stone. It's also above water. I first applied its local color, it's more red, and I've added shadows as well, using Payne's Grey, Ultramarine, and Orange, our usual mix. You may have other hues. You can use umber or burnt sienna. Every artist has their own usual palette, and the artist knows how to use these hues and mix the colors used in the works the most. I think that with time you'll also form your own palettes, and it doesn't have to be a copy of my palette. Every artist uses their own hues and colors. I've added more dark shadow parts to the stones. I'm not afraid of doing it because I understand that the shadows on the stones above the water are the darkest areas in this work. I leave a small gap and add the reflection to the stone in the center. By the way, this phenomenon, this light rim contacting with the stone, is very common. You can see it in many references and also in nature. It's this place where the water touches the stone and it slightly curves. I don't really know how to explain it. It's like a junction of two environments, this glowing halo, like a light stripe. It's another observation that you can use. I start to paint reflections further from the stones. We see some trees in the background, and they also cast reflections on the most prominent parts of the waves, and we show them. Here, consider where the lightest parts in your work are, the most blue or the lightest, or better both. The prominent parts of the waves ideally should differ in tone and hue and stand out. My perception of this work cannot be whole without painting the left group of the stones. So I want to show their tone right away and then do the reflections, like cherry on the cake. I cover the stone with local color again. It's got this gray tone. And I add the shadow. I do it on wet to get soft edges within the stone. We wipe the upper part like this. It now slightly merges with the water behind the stone. We'll fix that, don't worry. For now, it's important to show the shadow of the stone. And this stone also has reflected light. If you look closely, it's visible, and even if you don't see it, you know it exists. So, in order to create reflected light, we can wipe like this. And intensify the core shadow. But I don't do it at the very bottom, I leave some space for the reflected light. It adds volume to our stone. We'll now show this orangish horizontal stone. I've added more orange and maroon to it. We can add pink hue again. I have a very pink hue in my palette, it's called Violet Pink. It's actually glowing, but I add just a tiny bit. You can also use quinacridone, but it's a bit different. I add shell pink. You can see that it contains white. And if you look closely, you can notice that. I show this stone as cool in the shadow. I use this blue hue of ultramarine and with addition of shadows using Payne's Grey. If you don't have such pink hues or shell pink, you can buy another hue. It's called Cool Grey by Mijello. For example, it's very opaque. It resembles white gouache, but it's not gouache. You can add it to mixes to make the paint more opaque. Opacity is necessary when, for example, you add color to a wash and you want this wash to keep its shape rather than flow, and it doesn't let the other color flow. We should remember to show the cast shadow of the stone above. And meanwhile, I'll intensify the core shadow of the stone at the base. I show the reflections like this. And again, I leave a narrow stripe right along the edge where the water and stone meet. There'll be this light stripe and it's visible in the reference too. You might miss it if you didn't look at the reference carefully, but when I point it out, you'll definitely remember it. And you will start to notice these things. Note the shape of the reflections. It must match the shape of the stone and be kind of logical. It means we don't actually copy things here, but we try to build it, imagining where the spot should be located. I mean, the spot that reflects in the water. I'll remind you that while the shadow depends on the angle of sun rays, The reflections are always built strictly vertically. The lines from above are moved below, and they usually coincide in height too. I slightly darkened the stone on the right. It looked lighter in relation to the other stones and kind of stood out. I add reflections of this stone right away. There's a wave movement and the reflection is this small in this area, but it's probably due to the wave movement, so the reflection only got to this part. And I surely remember to leave this light stripe next to the stone. I tried to blur it, although it's light, it's not white, so I slightly blur it. Now we can look at the work from a distance. Of course, this white stripe at the top interferes with our perception of the work as a whole, so I suggest that we fix it. I now cover only the upper part. I wet it with water using a white flat brush. I try to do it evenly. If you worry you cannot do it evenly, you can use masking tape. I take a synthetic brush with a fine tip and I apply this pea green. It's a mix of cadmium yellow and ultramarine. I add more cerulean at the top, as if there is sky there. We can also mix cerulean with Naples yellow. It'll also give us an interesting green hue. But please don't take green straight from the pans or tubes. Mix complex hues. I always encourage you to do this so that you get natural colors. Here it's not even green, it's a mix of ultramarine and orange in action again, and we add a little yellow to it. It becomes green in tone. I use a darker hue on the right, add in Payne's Grey to this mix. I want to warn you against using excessively dark colors in the background. I think that color I've used here is too dark and the boundary is too sharp. I'll be fixing it later. But for now, I need to reach the right tone. I've decided not to paint all the unusual thin trees that we see in the background. I'll concentrate on the stones instead. So I'm simply building this green mass, but I don't paint it all in one color. I add more orange hues, cool tones too. We practiced doing that in the first work. So here you can let your imagination fly. So we apply these green hues like this, very delicately, but without details. I feel like adding some midtones, darken some areas. Consider your situation and see what you feel like doing, and use your imagination. I now want to soften the sharp boundary, so I add more maroon. If you look closely at the reference, there is this reflection of the coast. That's why it's got this hue. But I don't claim anything, you may mix a different hue. It's okay if you don't see maroon there. These are my art peculiarities, my perception. Our goal now is to blur the sharp edge so that the coast gets smoothly incorporated into the wash. So I blend it using this brush again. Try to do it carefully. You can experiment with vertical movements. Try horizontal ones too. Just make sure that the boundaries of the wash are invisible and that there aren't too dark hues in the background. And we blend it like this. I wipe some places so that the horizon line, the coastline, looks more even. I'll wipe a bit more here, but actually you don't have to copy my actions here. I got a bit of a crutch situation with the background. I blurred it and the coastline got uneven, so it wasn't straight anymore, and I wanted to make it horizontal again because the coast in the distance has a more even edge. It's actually because it's in the distance and all lines in the distance become more horizontal. We don't see steep hills and diagonals, waves. The lines in the distance are calm and more straight. It affects the perception of space in your work. Note that. That's why I wipe it, because the reflection got bigger in some places and smaller in others. And so this line gets interrupted and it's not perceived as a horizontal line. It seemed crooked, so I'm trying to fix that. No panic, we just work on it to the point when it looks appropriate. Okay, so I even decided to use white gouache to fix some irregularities. And I want to eliminate this big reflection spot that interfered with the overall perception of the background. The gouache got smoothly incorporated into the wash. Everything looks more harmonious and I'm satisfied. Next, I mix this green hue using cadmium yellow, ultramarine, and possibly a little orange to mute it, and Payne's Grey to darken it. And we need to do the reflections of the background, the forest. That's why their hue is green. This is my favorite part. I love working with this fine brush. Look for the shape of the reflections. They're not just lines, they break, they have their own character. Painting these lines is like a meditation. I particularly like this stage of work. I show these lines on the most prominent parts of the waves, keeping in mind how we build the volume structure of waves. And again, I don't copy the reference. I'm guided by it, but I consider my own situation and see how my hand moves and how lines are built. If something's missing, I add my own details to make the reflections look more harmonious and complete. Like so. I try to stick to horizontal movement because the waves go like this. They're not exactly horizontal. You see a small incline there. It's normal too. Waves don't have to be aligned with the edge of the sheet and be strictly horizontal. It's vice versa. I recommend creating a small incline for these waves, just a few degrees. It will make the work more dynamic and it will add movement. And if we do strict horizontal waves, it'll be more boring, not as interesting to look at for our viewer. And the viewers, I will simply glide from left to right and leave the sheet. I try to make these reflection lines less detailed and much lighter in the distance. I encourage you to pay attention to that. Don't do the reflections in the distance too dark or black. The reflections closer to us must be darker. It's also about light and aerial perspective laws. All objects in the distance seem lighter, and they also become more blue. Because the air consists of numerous water molecules, they accumulate in the distance, so the further the objects, the less we see them, the thicker the air. So a forest that looks very green and saturated in the foreground will acquire blue tones in the distance. It's another law of light and aerial perspective. Things in the distance are usually lighter and cooler. Of course, there are always exceptions, but knowing rules is useful. We can add more violet hues for this dark color. It's not even clear what hue it is. I'm just mixing everything that's left on my palette, and of course it should match the background. These reflections may also have the color of the sandbed. We see that there are stones peeping through the big reflections on the right. We see a more local color, so it means we can see the true color of the stones through the reflections. These lines are small here. We won't even paint stones inside these reflections. If some things ended up too dark, we can lighten them like this. Here I blur it because I want to model the shape of the waves. We can actually do it later. For now we need to apply reflections to the whole surface. Try to do it evenly without big gaps with no reflections. I call them bald spots. So make sure you don't leave such gaps, because the viewer's eye actually stops at the empty areas. It's immediately noticeable that something's not finished and doesn't look natural. The viewer's eye has been focusing on the objects in the natural environment, the physics laws. So even a minor violation of these physics laws in pictures and paintings is immediately noticeable. That's why artists must know physics and optics laws, how to depict objects. They must be knowledgeable and well prepared to be able to depict realistic plots. There are some reflection lines between the glints too, little strokes, and I've got a nice spot here where the reflection just belongs perfectly, I reckon. Although it's not that visible in the reference, the reflection there is quite small, but I want to make it beautiful and I paint it practically off the top of my head. It's not that expressive and noticeable in the reference. So I'm adding it in the places that I consider appropriate. And I also show more red tones between the glints. The water is really shallow here, so the stones are quite well visible in these places. That's why glints appeared here. So we can add even more maroons. Not pure maroon though, I'll blur it now like this. It looks like a stone peeping through, but it's not above water, it's underwater. We can confidently darken the reflection in the foreground as it's close to us. I also want to intensify the shadow onto the stone on the right. So I take this cool hue with ultramarine and I apply it under the stone. We can also add some shadows next to the nearby stone. I do all this on dry, I simply blur the sharp edges later. We're now at the stage when we can add more volume to the water. We now see the overall picture and we see the approximate location of the color areas. We even have the reflections ready, so we can intensify some shadows on water. I use this cool bluish hue to cover the shadow parts of the waves, so I go around the lightest areas where the reflections are, and I go between them in these horizontal strokes, adding shadows little by little. This way I kind of further highlight the prominent parts of the waves. So when you need to lighten something, you can use this trick and darken everything around it. Then this place that we want to lighten will seem lighter, when in fact it didn't change, we just darkened the surrounding area and it got lighter. We can paint the stones in more detail in the shadows because it's a perfect place to model the stones underwater. It's in the shadows where we see them well. While the most prominent parts of the waves reflect the sky, and we don't see the stones that well there. Although their outlines are visible in shallow water, they're just lighter and more blue. This will be helpful in your future works too, if you're going to paint stones underwater. I continue to add shadows on water, making it more 3D. Of course, we could skip this stage, but I want to show more depth, more volume and tone here. So I'm adding these cool horizontal lines over the dry wash, blur them with plain water and incorporate them in the wash. And you can't even tell it was painted as a separate layer. It looks like it was done in one go. I also go around the upper stone. I create a darker background around it. This way I eliminate its light part so that the stone doesn't merge with water. The reference clearly shows that the lit stone is lighter than the water around it. I add some shadows between the stones to these shadow parts of the waves. I'm doing some modeling here because that's where we see the stones more precisely. You can trace it in the reference, although not everyone will notice it. You have to know where to look, so to speak. What to pay attention to. I continue to add cool tones to the water, add more movement and volume. This stage transforms the work. It looked flatter before, it was less material, and this stage of adding cool reflections on dry in just a few places, it really enriches the work, makes it more expressive. And most importantly, the viewer cannot determine how it was painted. If we do everything properly and incorporate this wash into the previous one and blur everything carefully. The important thing here is to try and avoid sharp edges so that the wash doesn't stop abruptly. That's why we blur it. I feel like adding things here in the center too, show more volume between the stones, show the shadows, and I remember to blur it because the stones are underwater. I also add mid-tones. And now we can look at the work in a general way and add some things. I feel it lacks interesting details in the center here, so that the viewer's eye stops here, stays longer in the compositional center, so we add more elements there. I've added this wave. It's blue, and I've shown movement. Prolonged the wave on the left and joined it to the right part. Note this interesting curved line. It unified things. We can also show such movements following the shapes. If you look carefully, there are these blue lines in this area. That's where the sky is reflected against the stone background. We can show it too. It's also well visible in the reference how the blue sky affects this spot. It's created these miniature waves, and we see the sun passing through them and reflecting off the stones in these yellow lines. I'm actually painting these miniature waves now, since we've done the light lines on the central stone. I mean these yellow lines. We should also paint the blue waves. I continue to blur these miniature waves on water. It's a subtle movement of the wind. The sun passes through these little waves and casts the light lines on the stones. I carefully incorporate it into the wash so that it all looks even without hard boundaries and contrasts. I feel like adding blue hue here in the right part too. I take Verditer Blue, and here it's actually crucial that it contains some white. It will lighten the work a little, and it will get incorporated more harmoniously compared to just ultramarine paint. Because if we apply pure ultramarine here, we'll just darken the tone, but here I want to have a color without much darkening. That's why such paints that contain white are really useful. I'll certainly attach them to the materials list in this lesson. It's actually just my imagination working here, but it's not just a whim. I want to immerse the stones in water even more. And these blue lines where the sky is reflected will add materiality, so that no one doubts the fact that the stones are underwater. These stripes unify everything. I apply this blue pigment, creating the movement of water. I cover all stones at once, generalizing them and making the work more whole, immersing the stones in the environment. So yeah, my actions do have a certain purpose. It's really useful for every artist to approach the working process consciously and pursue a certain goal. Our actions should work to unveil an artistic image or an idea of yours. Okay, we have the last thing left, the most interesting stage. I take a melamine sponge and it will help us make the glints glow even more. Now they have sharp edges and they look a bit unnatural. We need to give them a glowing halo. So what do? I wet the sponge every time, so the sponge must be moist. I wet it using clean water and then I slightly squeeze it so it stays moist, and then I dab the places where the glints are. Next, I immediately dab these places with a clean, dry tissue, and if you do everything right, the edges of the glints get blurry like this, and they start to glow. Okay, one more time. I wet the sponge using clean water, squeeze it a little, and then I use this moist sponge and go over the glints as if it were a rubber. However, I don't go right over the white parts of the glints. I try to follow the outlines. If we wipe the white central part, it may get dark and fade. So I try to rub the outlines of the glints and not the glints themselves. It's quite important too. And I dab it with a tissue. Of course, the glints are small and their outlines aren't easily traceable in the distance. So there I simply go over the glints and the effect is good. But we see that some glints don't look white anymore. Some of the surrounding color gets inside the glints and they fade a little. But I'm okay with it. Okay, our work is approaching its completion. I'll add some final strokes using white paint. I want to adjust the shape of these glowing lines on the stones because it's one of the expressive parts of our work and something I'd really like to show and depict in the work. So I go over just a few lines in the places where I didn't wipe and lighten it properly. And I apply white paint there. If I feel that there aren't enough lines or they aren't bright enough, or maybe they look bleak, I apply just a few strokes. I add more Naples yellow and I go over them because I see they're almost yellow in the reference. But if you feel it's excessive, I'll understand. It's not an obligatory part. I'll intensify some little blue waves, these ripples. It's in the compositional center and it's an important element. And of course, I'll blur it with clean water to prevent sharp edges. In this work, you could notice that if we don't see sharp edges, it's not necessarily painted on wet. Turns out you can blur washes as you go without wetting the whole sheet. I think it will be news for some of you, and you'll want to use this method in the future. The skill of finishing a work is also important for an artist. Many get really tired at the end of the work and they run out of energy and time, and they don't take a critical look at the work and don't add the elements that will enrich the work and make it more expressive. That's why you can put off completing the work until the next day. This way you can take a fresh look at it and assess it, see what it really lacks. I think that my work is complete and I'm ready to sign it. I've chosen the left part of the sheet so that my white signature balances the glints a little, since they are located more to the right. You see, even the signature is placed thoughtfully. After having signed the work, I felt like adding some white paint to this lit part of the stone here. It looks a bit merged with the water, and I specifically wanted to separate them. So I've added a little orange-red hue there. I didn't just apply white. You may have your own incomplete things. I've also remembered that I didn't show the cast shadow of the upper stone here, so I'll fix that. It's worth paying attention to these things. That's why it's important to analyze the work and not hurry to post it on Instagram. I understand you very well in that every artist wants to share their works with the world, but sometimes such little faults like a missing shadow can cloud the spirits when you notice it after you've posted the work. I've been there too, believe me. Alright, now it's complete for sure. We've completed the 4th work of our transparency course. I hope you found this course useful and opened new horizons in painting water and just worked on your watercolor skills. I'll be happy to answer your questions if you have the feedback option. I'll gladly help and give advice and simply support you because I admire every student of mine. You're all very talented in your own ways. Try not to copy other artists' styles, look for your own way. Of course, studying is important, but it's in the process of learning that we form our own opinion and our personal style, our plots. I wish you all to discover your inner artist and, most importantly, enjoy the creative process. It's the most important thing when we enjoy the process. And of course, with time, we'll find joy in the results too. Well, my friends, I'll see you soon again. I was happy to share my knowledge. I look forward to your feedback and works under the hashtag CNastyLessons. See you!